here. So Mark Crispin Miller is a professor of media, culture, and communications at NYU. He is the founder of News from Underground and the author of numerous books, including Boxed In, The Culture of TV, Seeing Through Movies, Mad Scientists, The Secret History of Modern Propaganda, Spectacle, Operation Desert Storm and the Triumph of Illusion, and The Bush Dyslexicon. His newest book is Cruel and Unusual, Bush/Cheney's New World Order. At NYU, he teaches numerous courses, but one of the most notable is his popular Mass Persuasion and Propaganda course. And of late, he has been sort of the target of several campaigns that wish to discredit his multiple inquiries as conspiracy theories. And we are glad to have you here today, Mark, and welcome you. So thank you very much.
Well, it's my pleasure, and I want to thank you for inviting me. It's nice to be asked to speak to an academic group. I suppose I should tell my story. I should begin by telling the story of what happened to me here at NYU, because it's highly relevant and offers us, a way into the subject. As you noted, almost correctly, you said that I teach a popular course on propaganda. I don't anymore because I'm not allowed to teach it anymore, which is kind of astonishing when you think about it. But I don't think the people who have forbidden me to teach the course really doing that much thinking, in the classic sense of thought. What happened was in September of 2020, I was starting my propaganda course as usual, except for the fact that we were meeting remotely. I was teaching remotely. We were online. That aside, I began, as I always had done, having taught the course for some 20 years. I began by pointing out to the students that studying propaganda critically and impartially can be very difficult. And by that, I did not mean intellectually difficult, although sometimes it is. What I meant more precisely was that the study of propaganda can be difficult socially and psychologically. Because if you actually make the effort to study propaganda comprehensively, you will inevitably find that you have to move a little bit out of your comfort zone. This happens to me. I'm in my 70s. It continues to happen to me. It happens, I think, to anyone who honestly studies propaganda. You find that something you have believed, and sometimes fervently believed, has turned out to be false or half true or exaggerated or oversimple, because that's what propaganda tends to do. So in order to illustrate this point, I said to them, look at the way we're meeting. We're meeting in this unusual and really unpleasant way. You hate it, I hate it. Why are we doing this? Well, we're obviously doing this because of the COVID crisis, which has been driven from the start by a number of extremely compelling propaganda themes. Now, that doesn't mean that they're necessarily false, because propaganda can be factually accurate. Indeed, the word was coined by the Vatican in the 17th century to refer to the absolute truth, because as far as the Vatican was concerned, propaganda's purpose was to save people from going to hell when they died because they'd been misled by Protestant heresies. Propaganda can be true. However, it tends at least to be oversimple, one-sided, so that if, say, the COVID crisis is driven by propaganda at every level, we really have to study it very carefully. Then I picked as a particular example the mask mandates, and this was where I stepped in it, if you'll pardon the expression. I said that if we were to devote a week to the mask mandates in this course, or if you should decide to write a paper on the mask mandates, what's essential is to do a very thorough reading of the scientific literature going into the subject. It may interest you to know, I said to them that every randomized controlled trial of masking in hospital settings, and at the time I thought there had been 8, there had actually been 10, and since then there are more. This is the most rigorous kind of scientific study, and to date, all of those studies have found that masks are ineffective at blocking the transmission of respiratory viruses. You would want to read all those studies if you're going to look at that particular propaganda drive. And you would also want to read all the more recent studies that have come out finding otherwise. As you may remember that over the summer of 2020, a number of these studies came out, not randomized controlled trials, other kinds of studies, observational studies, modeling, etc. They all claim to find that masks do prevent transmission of respiratory viruses. So I said, you would need to read all of it, and you need to read it all carefully. They're not scientists, nor am I. So I gave them a little guidance on how non-scientists can begin to assess new studies. You know, there are often scientist reviews posted. I gave them some sites they could visit to locate those reviews. I advised them, as was appropriate in a propaganda course, to take note of the universities where the supportive studies have been carried out, and then check to see if they have any partnerships with big pharma and or have received funding from the Gates Foundation, because this is always relevant to the study of propaganda. And that was that. You know, the takeaway on the subject of propaganda was that everyone is capable of identifying propaganda that they don't agree with. That's easy. However, it's not so easy to identify it when you agree with it. So when it pushes your buttons, you will tend not even to perceive that it is propaganda. You'll just think it's the truth. All right, I made all these points clear. A few days later, one of the students in the course was on Twitter demanding that I be fired for having put the students at risk. And she went to my website, markcrispinmiller.com. It's called News from Underground. I think you were kind enough to mention it. And what that is a site where everything I send to my listserv every day ends up. And what I send to my listserv every day is material that has either been blacked out by the media or misreported by the media. And then, you know, once we've sent this stuff out every day, as I say, it ends up on the website. So this student went to the website, took a number of screenshots, and I mean, this wasn't just one tweet, it was like a dozen tweets, livid tweets, really pissed off. And she flung a number of these screenshots onto her Twitter account and said that they had all come from far right or conspiracy websites. You know, I'm not entirely sure what that means. I know that I'm not far right by any stretch of the imagination. Anyway, that happened. And although it was not pleasant and it was unprecedented for me, it wasn't that big of a deal in itself, because that's her First Amendment right to express her view of the course, so that even though I would have preferred, for pedagogical reasons, that she had brought up her objections in the class, because that's always fruitful, she did what she did. But what was a big deal was the fact that NYU immediately sided with her. My department chair tweeted his thanks to her. He wrote, "We as a department have made this a priority and are discussing next steps." And this was my firing that he was, you know, publicly endorsing on Twitter. The next day, the dean of the school that I teach in, the Steinhardt School, and the doctor who determines COVID policy for NYU, very, very draconian policies, both emailed my other students directly without putting me on copy, hinted that I had given them dangerous misinformation, and included a list of links to the more recent studies basically telling the class to read those and believe those, which is the opposite of what I was doing. I've never told my students what to think. And indeed, practically on a weekly basis, would always say, don't believe a single word I say, okay? You may hear me say things that are shocking or provocative, but I'm not asking you to believe any of them. I think that if you are struck by something I say, you should look into it yourself. If it turns out that I'm right, you've learned something. If it turns out that I'm wrong, you should tell me, and then I'll revise my view. But this was completely different. This was a kind of bureaucratic intervention in my class that no doubt has everything to do with NYU's very close relationship to Big Pharma. And this is what I would say to a propaganda class. And also the Board of Trustees of NYU, which is enormous, is also essentially, you know, the men and a few women who are behind the financial reset. I mean, it's the same people. It is really remarkable. So in retrospect, it isn't that surprising what happened to me. At any rate, the day after those two bureaucrats basically taught my class for me, I was asked by my chair not to teach the propaganda course the following semester. He claimed some reason having to do with enrollments. It was just you know, untrue on its face. They just didn't want me to teach it anymore. But he did assure me that I would be able to teach it after a year. That, however, turned out not to be true. I am not allowed to teach it. And indeed, they are so intent on my not teaching it that they're not even offering it under anybody's auspices. So nobody's studying propaganda at NYU at a moment when it seems to me, critical study of propaganda has never been more urgent. Not only do I believe that I should be teaching it still, and anybody else who wants to teach it should be teaching it still, but I believe it should be taught at every high school and college in the country. I think it's absolutely essential for people to learn how to recognize it, because if this crisis, it seems to me, has taught us anything, it's that humankind has really not progressed a centimeter since, well, certainly since, say, World War I, which was another moment when everybody was intoxicated by a propaganda drive, in that case against Germany. But even going back centuries to you know, the moment when witches were burned all over Europe, it seems to me that the irrationality and the aggression that have been incited systematically and successfully over this long moment are the kind of thing that we will never be free from if we don't actually learn how to perceive propaganda when it's all around us, perceive it even when we approve of its message, and learn how to sort of think back against it, how to tell the difference between its truth claims and its falsehoods. So, you know, I am quite serious about the urgency of grappling with this subject pedagogically, and again, grateful for your invitation, which gives me a chance to talk about it, you know, with other academics. There is a group, for those of you who are interested, you may know this, it's called the Organization for Propaganda Study. I'm on the board. It is an international consortium of academics who understand the urgency of teaching propaganda and teaching it so that you're not actually engaging in it. All right, let me explain what I mean by that. I recently got hold of a number of syllabi for propaganda courses at several top flight American universities, including Harvard and Princeton and Yale. And what's striking about the propaganda courses taught at those schools is that they all overstress the totalitarian approach to propaganda. They spent a lot of time on the Nazi propaganda. They spent a lot of time on the Bolshevik propaganda. One of the, I think it's at Harvard, the syllabus is very cutely adorned with Soviet posters, you see. So there's a kind of nostalgia there, and a kind of a presumption of superiority, that those people were so stupid and so undemocratic, and look what happens when you allow propaganda to take over. And I heard a little bit of the discussion of Alex Jones. You may not be surprised to hear that in the syllabus, when they talk about the present, they talk only about Trump and the right, the far right, I should say, to quote my student, the conspiracy websites and so on. So that's all actually itself propaganda. I think it's crucial to understand that propaganda, as we not only understand it, but as we live under it, is not something the Nazis invented. It's not something the Bolsheviks invented, although the Bolsheviks had their own sort of Marxist-Leninist take on it. The Nazis were tutored by British propaganda. Hitler is quite explicit about this in Mein Kampf. He learned a great deal about propaganda practice from the British during World War I. Therefore, it's important to give up the illusion, the sort of self-congratulating illusion, that it's something that they did, something that they do, something that totalitarians do, something that is not characteristic of democratic societies. As a matter of fact, propaganda, whether political or commercial, is an Anglo-American innovation. It was perfected by the British and by the United States, and first rolled out, I have to qualify this statement, but we date the history of modern propaganda from World War I, which was the first time that governments systematically engaged in it with an eye towards mobilizing their entire populations to support a conflict that they would never have approved if they understood what it was really about, and one that they would never have signed up for if they had any idea of what an atrocious experience it was going to be. What with such innovations as poison gas and landmines and tanks and barbed wire, and we should add propaganda. These are all, very, very lethal inventions that characterized the First World War as a slaughter. And I would argue that the propaganda deployed to get people to support it was probably, arguably, far more lethal even than any of those horrific military innovations. So this is, what we're basically talking about is the need to observe a certain intellectual humility, a certain political flexibility, a certain willingness to give up assumptions, beliefs that one had embraced and promoted. I'll give you an example, on some mistake that I have made. I'm sure that some, if not all of you, have read Edward Bernays' Propaganda, which was published in 1928. And I was asked to write the introduction to that new edition from IG Publishing in Brooklyn. And in it, I make the point, which I've already made, that propaganda need not be deceptive, it need not be false, and that it can even be benign. And I listed a number of examples of propaganda that we cannot fault for destructiveness, campaigns to get people to wear their seatbelts, right, that kind of thing. I also mentioned in this introduction vaccines, right? I listed vaccines as one of those great things that honest propaganda gets us to approve and gets us to comply with whatever mandates there may be. Well, I've learned a great deal since I wrote that introduction, going on 20 years ago. For one thing, having lost a nephew to a battery of his vaccines when he was 2 months old, I didn't know any of this when I wrote the introduction, but that's just it. When you study reality through the lens of propaganda, you learn a great deal that you would not learn otherwise. Now, I said at the beginning that propaganda can be difficult socially and psychologically. And this is true in no small part because there are some extremely powerful interests involved in the production or the orchestration of propaganda drives. In fact, one could go so far as to say that the most powerful interests out there are involved in propaganda of the kind that we're faced with now. This moment is different from previous moments in the history of propaganda in several very important ways. I think probably the paramount way in which propaganda now is unprecedented is that this is a global drive, and we have not seen this before. This is a global propaganda drive wherein the media systems of country after country all around the world, even countries that are at odds with each other, right, are all basically engaged in telling versions of the same story. For a long time, I was overly sanguine about the ostensible opposition between China and the West, and between Russia and the West, and had wanted to think that the vaccination drives in those countries were somehow less toxic and destructive than the vaccination drive has been elsewhere. But it's not true. And indeed, if you go back to the beginning of this 2+ year ordeal that we've been living through, and it's always very, very helpful to do a kind of timeline when you're studying a propaganda drive and see where it began, how it began, how it was then modified, and so on. One of the most striking things about the onset of this propaganda drive was the complete agreement between propaganda videos that were coming out of China and then their republication in, say, the British tabloid press. I'm sure you remember those videos of people dropping dead in the streets of China. Remember this? I mean, they weren't terribly realistic, but that's sort of not the point. People were so terrorized by this specter of the plague to end all plagues that the unlikeliness of some of the images did not have any effect on them. People were dropping dead in the streets. Some of them were putting their hands out at the last minute to keep themselves from hurting their faces. It didn't matter. This was frightening. This was terrifying. These images were amplified throughout the British tabloid press, which is a striking moment of agreement, propaganda agreement across ostensible ideological boundary lines, see? And then we look at China's status as the first nation to respond to COVID-19 by locking down and doing it in a very draconian way. And the World Health Organization, a global body, hailed China for taking this tough stand. This is the World Health Organization since its effective purchase by Bill Gates. And we know that Bill Gates is very close to Xi Jinping. China was the first to urge masking. 2 months after Dr. Fauci went on 60 Minutes to say very pointedly, there's no good that masks will do. They don't stop respiratory viruses. They may make you feel better, but the science tells us that they don't work. That was one rare instance where Dr. Fauci was actually honoring the scientific consensus. But then 2 months later, this was in March that he went on 60 Minutes, George Gao, the head of the Chinese CDC, having said, you've got to wear a mask, the people in the West have to wear masks, we're wearing masks. Fauci then changed his tune and said, we all have to wear masks. Then he later lied about that, but we don't have to get that granular about it. The World Health Organization, a few months after Fauci changed his tune and the CDC changed his tune, the World Health Organization also changed its tone, having made videos with people, WHO functionaries speaking very slowly so that people could understand, telling the citizens of the world, there's no point in wearing a mask, they don't help, they don't work. All of a sudden, the WHO was saying, you've got to wear a mask. They were following China's lead. They said the science had changed. They actually said further studies have come out. But a BBC reporter noted in her story that one of her sources inside the World Health Organization had told her this was not based on science, this was a political decision. So here we have example after example of China kind of taking the lead. There's also the fact that China developed the ventilator policy that kills like 9 out of 10 of the elderly people who are intubated. The World Health Organization hailed that protocol and recommended it to the whole world, and also hailed New Zealand for being the first nation to follow China's example of strict lockdown. At any rate, let me say one other thing about this. The agreement of seemingly opposed interests. Every week on my Substack, I post compilations of reports of sudden deaths. The series is called Died Suddenly, and it's extremely useful, not just to give us, because it gives us a fairly accurate sense of the true toll of those injections, but it also helps us understand how the media has been functioning throughout this whole disaster. Once upon a time, not that long ago, died suddenly, that phrase was obituary code for suicide or a drug overdose. Now it's very different. So, died suddenly was fairly infrequently used by journalists because it had that sort of, a tactful second meaning, or those two second meanings. By now, and this really started months ago, but by now, died suddenly or died unexpectedly is used so often that it's just about impossible for me even to keep up with them all. And I'm talking about worldwide, all over the world, country after country, people dying suddenly. And in these cases, although now and then it does appear to have been suicide or a drug overdose. And when that happens, we tend to find out about it shortly thereafter. The vast majority of these stories are stories of people who literally did just that. They just dropped dead, just died, right? Another unusual feature of this surge is that about half the time, roughly, there is no cause of death reported. That's unprecedented, okay? Because only very, very old people formerly would have their deaths reported without any reference to a cause. If they're like 95 years old, you figure they died of old age. They were, sick. They had various comorbidities. But now, in a very, very high number of instances, even very famous people, maybe I should say especially very famous people, like Bob Saget, I could go through the list of the other high-profile people who have just died, But certainly there's never any reference to vaccination. They never mention that. And indeed, if anybody brings it up, they become livid. But they don't give any other reason either. That's about half the time. In many other instances, the deaths are reported to be due to heart attack, stroke, blood clot, or cardiac arrest. And we now know full well that those are all extremely common adverse events post-vaccination. You can see this if you wade into the VAERS database. It's not user-friendly, I think by design, but if you stick with it, you'll find that cardiological mishaps are they are really pandemic now. And thirdly, people dying of sudden and aggressive cancers. Dr. Ryan Cole is a name you may know. It was the first doctor out there who maybe 8 months ago or so was reporting that the vaccines had apparently so weakened many people's immune systems that it has made them susceptible to cancers that they ordinarily would have fought off, and other illnesses as well that would not have been lethal for them, but that are now because of the ravaged state of their immunities. So I'm doing this, there's a partial propaganda reason for it. I don't hesitate to admit. If you talk to people about the current uptick in all-cause mortality, because by now it is beyond dispute that all-cause mortality has increased exponentially. Whether this data comes from the insurance industry or from VAERS or from other databases in other countries or from the military, its DMED database, you can find any number of sources that justify your noting a statistical increase in all-cause deaths, right? But as Stalin said infamously, when one person dies, it's a tragedy. Or when 1 million die, it's a statistic, okay? People are basically and understandably sort of unmoved by that abstract suggestion that the number of deaths has gone way up. Because once you translate that into statistics, it loses all of its poignancy. It ceases to relate to actual human beings dropping dead all around us, even as we speak. So my thought was to compile all these articles, to put names and faces together with these people. And on top of that, to demonstrate how the media has been seeking to normalize all this, which is a crucial propaganda tactic. This is much more effective. And of course, therefore, those of us who engage in this kind of contradiction of the prevailing narrative are inevitably coming under heavy fire, okay? Now, let me say something about this. I will hark back to the young woman who demanded that I be fired. She said that my stuff I'd put up on my website all comes from far right and conspiracy websites. Now, let me unpack that for you, because I think it's illuminating for us as students of propaganda. Far right, okay. Let's start with conspiracy websites. I may be telling you something that you know already, but the reason why the phrase conspiracy theory and the phrase conspiracy theorist both spring so readily to all our lips as they do, the reason why I'm sure each one of you has said at one time or another, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but. I don't know if you have. I mean, I used to. I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but. That is a way to basically admit with some embarrassment that you entertained suspicions about elite intentions, okay? That kind of suspicion used to be absolutely acceptable in American society. Americans historically have never been shy about accusing elites of nefarious purposes. And this goes back to the Declaration of Independence, which if it came out today, it would probably be dismissed as a conspiracy theory. Some of what they accused George III of doing, he had done. Other things they accused him of doing, he actually hadn't done. So it was a kind of a catch-all of kingly transgressions, you see. Now, what happened to change this, what happened to make conspiracy theory a no-no when it had been, kind of an all-American attitude, was a propaganda drive kicked off in 1967 by the CIA, which early in the year sent out its memo 1035-960 to all its station chiefs worldwide. The purpose of this memo, and you can find it online, the memo, very easily. And you can also read all about it in a book called Conspiracy Theory in America by Lance DeHaven Smith. It's a professor of public policy at Florida Atlantic University, who wrote the book at my suggestion for a series I was editing for the University of Texas Press. It's a masterful history of this whole episode, which has had such major consequences of all kinds ever since then. As he notes, the CIA, and as the memo makes quite clear, the CIA was troubled by and worried about the popularity, the recent popularity of several books that were questioning the Warren Report. Okay, this is the official explanation of John Kennedy's murder in Dallas on November 22nd, 1963. Mark Lane, the lawyer, wrote Rush to Judgment, which was the most popular of these several books. There were other people as well, writing books, traveling around the country, giving radio interviews, talking to college students and so on. They were all demonstrating, I mean, there were like 3 or 4 such books, but they were all demonstrating that the Warren Report is a joke, that none of the evidence in it supports the executive summary, that it is highly problematic, to say the least. None of these authors hazarded an explanation of what really did happen. All they did is what students of propaganda must begin by doing, which is simply to question the prevailing narrative. It's a different exercise to determine what actually did happen. Sometimes it's impossible to make that determination. But the first thing you do is simply test the plausibility of the prevailing narrative, and these writers were doing it. Some of them did an extremely good job, hence the CIA's uneasiness. There was also something that the agency did not mention in the memo, but was probably on their minds, and that is that while these books were being published and avidly read, Jim Garrison, the district attorney in New Orleans, was also suing Clay Shaw over his complicity in the plot, because there was a wing of the conspiracy that was very active in New Orleans, and Jim Garrison was on that case. And of course, it's his story that Oliver Stone tells in the movie JFK. There's no doubt that the CIA was very troubled by this lawsuit as well. So what did they ask in the memo? The memo went to all their station chiefs worldwide and urged them to use their propaganda assets and friends in the media, I believe that that's a quote, to discredit the writings of these conspiracy theorists, and they use that phrase, and they recommended various, what we would call talking points for these people to make in their propaganda assaults on these people's character, say. For example, here's one that I'm sure you have heard because it continues to be used. The line is, well, if there were a conspiracy on such a scale, somebody would have talked by now. Okay, you hear this all the time. You hear it in response to critical discussions of 9/11, the Kennedy assassination, the King assassination. Well, surely somebody would have talked because so many people had to be involved. Well, actually, that's not true. It is possible to have a very, very effective covert operation about which none of the participants say a word. The Manhattan Project, for example, involved about 120,000 people, quite a few people, 6 figures. Nobody ever said a word, partly because these projects are often, there's a great deal of compartmentalization that goes on in them. So everybody who's part of it doesn't really know what role their work plays vis-a-vis the finished product. And also a lot of these people are under military discipline. And when you're under military discipline, you tend to keep your mouth shut. Moreover, as it happens, a lot of people talked after the Kennedy assassination, and many of them ended up being murdered. There's at least 2 books, going over the toll of all those people who had something to say about the assassination and then died untimely deaths afterwards. So this is a pure propaganda utterance. If there were a conspiracy on such a scale, somebody would have talked by now. Well, no, that's actually not true. But it works as propaganda. And it works as propaganda for a very important reason. Propaganda, effective propaganda, can only work if it tells people what they want to hear, okay? You cannot have a successful propaganda drive that tries to get people to believe something they do not want to believe. That's why the technicians of propaganda, the experts, are those who are skilled at finding a new language in which to represent the thing you want people to believe. You have to put it in terms that will make them sign on, right? Nobody wants to believe. I mean, maybe there are some who do. Maybe this is hyperbole, but very few people want to believe that their own government would murder the president of the United States in broad daylight. Very few people want to believe that their own government would somehow be involved in flying aircraft into the Twin Towers and the Pentagon. Nobody wants to believe that the chief health authorities of the nation and the world would deliberately and systematically offer medical advice that is, to put it mildly, deleterious. Nobody wants to believe that. They would rather think, well, maybe they're just incompetent, or maybe they just didn't know, or maybe they're just, greedy. Maybe it's just greed. It just has to do with corporate greed. Nobody wants to believe. Nobody wants to believe that the health authorities of their own government in the world would deliberately lie about the safety and effectiveness of early remedies like hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin, right? Nobody wants to believe any of that. Therefore, thus far, those propaganda drives that have dismissed dissidents as conspiracy theorists, as kooks, have had a certain advantage. I say thus far because I think this is beginning to change. They have had the advantage of telling people a more attractive story than I'm telling you, right? When I describe my Died Suddenly series, I'm not telling an attractive story. I'm telling a very upsetting story, right? And it's the toll of the vaccines appears to be just as bad. I have to finish this thought, in China and in Russia as it is here. So, much as I formerly wanted desperately to believe that, their vaccines are somehow not as toxic as the ones we're using here or the ones in Israel, it's not the case. This is not an appealing story, no matter where you sit on the ideological spectrum. Whereas those who say, this is nonsense, this is bullshit, these people are they're guilty of disinformation, they're probably terrorists, domestic terrorists, all this, as over the top as it is and as demonstrably false as it is appealing. It has appeal as long as people, think of the authorities in roughly the same way that abused children think of their abusive parents. This is before they come to face what their parents did to them. Comparably, people tend to think of the authorities whom they obey as parental figures, whether it's, Trump for Republicans or Biden for Democrats or Dr. Fauci or Bill Gates or whoever you want to mention, People like to think that these people mean well and are interested in our welfare. It is therefore asking a lot of many people to urge that they reconsider that sanguine impression of those in power, right? That's a tough one. So that's where conspiracy comes from as a cudgel to be used against dissidents. It comes from the CIA. It comes from that memo in 1967. If you go to the archive, the New York Times and the Washington Post and say Time Magazine, right? Go to the online archives. This is what I did. I'm not going to, I'll say this very succinctly. In 2005, my book, Fooled Again, came out. This was about the theft of the 2004 election for Bush Cheney, who were not really reelected, who also had not actually been elected in 2000. That's something else. The book was published by Basic Books. It was very thorough. It was, thoroughly vetted by lawyers. Everything is sourced, it's scholarly and so on. And the publisher and I both thought, we were quite excited that the book was coming out because we both believed naively that it would jumpstart a much needed national discussion of the urgent need for radical reform of the American voting system, which is the worst in the developed world. I mean, that is a scholarly consensus, right? Well, that did not happen because the book was, on the one hand, almost completely blacked out by the corporate media. There were a total of 2 newspaper reviews in the whole country, and one was a hostile review, and both papers were second-string newspapers. NPR, on which I'd been a guest maybe a dozen times, refused to have me on to discuss the book. So there was a blackout by the legacy media, and the New York Times, for which I'd also written 5 or 6 op-ed pieces over the years, would not go near this. It wouldn't touch it. So it was a blackout. But stranger than that, much stranger, was the fact that while the corporate media blacked the book out, the left press, for which I had written for decades, called it conspiracy theory and called me a conspiracy theorist. And this was my introduction to the term. This is why I went to those archives to do searches on that phrase, because once I got over the shock of having been dismissed like that, I really wanted to know, where did this come from? When did this become a thing, right? When did Americans begin reflexively to dismiss, disquieting speculations as conspiracy theory? And my research answered that question. It was 1967. It was because of the CIA memo, and thereafter, the use of those phrases simply kept on spiking. So by now, it would be impossible to do a search on those phrases. I mean, it would take you to the end of time to accommodate them all. There are so many. It has been so thoroughly internalized by all of us. And it is, again, it is a way of reassuring yourself that the awful truth that you don't want to be true cannot be true because those suggesting it are crazy, okay? So that's where, when the student tweeted that all my stuff comes from conspiracy websites, even though I'm sure she had no real idea what that meant, this is a meme that she had, internalized long since, and assumed that if here's an example of one of the things she posted in fury, one of the screenshots she put up. This was a very interesting graph that was published in 2013 showing where the left press gets its funding from. So we're talking about Democracy Now!, The Nation, all these outlets, outlets I'd written for. I'd been on Democracy Now! Many times myself. This graph shows where their funding comes from. And it comes from largely the Ford Foundation or the Rockefeller Foundation or the Open Society Institute. These are all well-established CIA pass-throughs. I thought that this chart was interesting and significant and that it should be shared. This young woman, whose Twitter profile is BLM, defund the police, she was just infuriated that I had shared this information because it impugned the integrity of press outlets that she wants to think are pure, you see? So it's a conspiracy. It comes from a conspiracy website. Okay, now, far right and conspiracy websites. So we've covered conspiracy websites, and I've given you a little thumbnail history of where that notion of conspiracy theory comes from, it's very important to know where it comes from, that it comes from one of the most successful covert propaganda drives in American history. Now let's talk about the other wing of that dyad, shall we? Far right, okay. Now, and this also pertains to what I heard you all discussing with Alex Jones, and we can talk about him too. This is very interesting. When you go back and you read the memo from 1967, in its prose, you'll find an aside about the utility of associating the conspiracy theorists with communist propaganda. Okay, this is an aside, but it's completely predictable and understandable within the context of the Cold War, right? This is 1967, so the Cold War had many years to go, and it was obviously on the CIA's mind, and they understood, of course, that associating dissident figures with communist propaganda, although I don't actually think any communist outlets were looking into the Kennedy assassination. I could be wrong about that. But it makes perfect sense that back then they would say there's something, these are commies, or they're doing the work of commies, see, by asking questions about Kennedy's assassination. Well, something has happened in the years since the memo came out that is highly relevant to where we are today, and in particular, highly relevant to how propaganda functions now, okay? Starting around 2010, so this would be under Obama, conspiracy theory started to change its color, you might say. You read the memo, you can clearly see the conspiracy theory was meant to appear to be ridiculous. It was meant to be a laughing matter. If you're a conspiracy theorist, you wear a tinfoil hat. You've all heard these lines. You're a tinfoil hat wearing loony. You're a barking moonbat. Somebody once called me a barking moonbat. There are all kinds of insults that spring to the lips of the hostile. But the point is that conspiracy theory initially was not only identified with the left, far left, but was I've just lost the thread of what I was saying, but was funny, a laughing matter, so that anybody who articulates conspiracy theory is kind of a standing joke, right? But starting in 2010, it starts to shift. It starts to shift so that conspiracy theory is becoming less ludicrous and more dangerous. That it's becoming a matter of threats to national security. It's becoming a matter of the most offensive kind of hate speech. In 2000 and I believe 14, David Owen, the Prime Minister of the UK, gave a speech, I think at the UN, in which he said, conspiracy theorists are more dangerous than ISIS. Okay, this was a new note. The following year, Francois Hollande, president of France, was giving a talk to a group of Holocaust survivors, and he linked conspiracy theory to Nazi propaganda. Okay, these were not just sort of random remarks. They are part of a narrative that's taking shape throughout the second decade of the century, that is making conspiracy theory ever less derisory. It's less and less a matter of snickering at people, and more a matter of contending with something that's deeply dangerous, something that is seditious, something that is terroristic. Okay, and this has intensified, particularly since Donald Trump became president in 2016. All of this, in a sense, all that we're discussing here, vis-a-vis COVID, the vaccines, has everything to do with Trump becoming president. My own view, and I'm not, remember I said, don't believe a single word I say. This is just my view, and I expect someday to be able to either verify or disprove it. But I believe that Trump's placement in the White House was crucial to the rollout of the whole COVID melodrama. And let me explain briefly what I mean by melodrama. Propaganda always reduces the entire field of reality to one thing. That's something it always does. So there's Trump, 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 there's Putin, there's Trump, there's Trump, there's Trump, there's Putin. Everything that's wrong with American politics, what is it? It's Trump. George W. Bush, wonderful guy. Dick Cheney, a peach, an angel. They're all great. George Bush Sr., Mitt Romney, all of them, they're wonderful human beings. But Trump, that fucking Trump, Trump's a monster. Trump, 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 right? Putin, Trump, Putin, Trump, Putin. Now, of course, we've got Ukraine, right? So there's no war in Yemen. There's no war in Syria. There's no war in Ethiopia. There are no wars anywhere. There's only Ukraine. And Ukraine, of course, it's Putin, which is Trump, Putin, Ukraine, Russia, okay? Well, climate change, okay? There is an enormously successful climate change propaganda, according to which the only threat to the environment of the world is CO2. It is not air pollution. It is not water pollution. It is not microplastics in the ocean. It is not glyphosate. It is not chemical fertilizer runoff, okay? It is not radioactivity. I could go on and on. There are a lot of existential threats to the environment, but the climate change propaganda talks only about the one. There is no other. There is only that. So propaganda is, on the one hand, kind of monomaniacal. You know, it induces a kind of obsessiveness within the propagandee that is much like certain kinds of mental illness, you see? So that, you know, when you're talking about somebody like Hitler, who was a propaganda genius, but also a true believer in his own propaganda, what the Nazi propaganda said about the Jews, 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 the Jews are our misfortune. Anything that's wrong, it is the Jews, it is the Jews. Well, Hitler believed this with every fiber of his being. His last known words were a reaffirmation of that creed, that he was basically reaffirming at the last minute his lifelong mission of destroying world Jewry. So, you know, this raises very interesting questions about where deliberate, conscious misrepresentation ends and where delusion begins. And that's really a very interesting question to raise vis-a-vis propaganda. And George Orwell did us a big favor by coming up with the concept of doublethink, which sort of helps us understand how that works. Okay, at any rate, propaganda is on the one hand monomaniacal, and it's also inevitably, and this is related, melodramatic. Okay, what is melodrama? Unlike tragedy, which is, you know, usually a story of a tragic hero who is divided within, fatally flawed within, melodrama always tells a story that is black and white, that is good versus evil. So most of the stuff we watch on TV and in the movies is melodrama. You know, much that we read is melodrama. The news coverage tends to be very melodramatic. The propaganda is always melodramatic, okay? So that if you try to, you know, complicate the narrative, if you try to introduce shades of gray into it, you are a heretic. You are a dissident. You know, you are basically, there is no punishment bad enough for you, okay? So now we are living in a moment when it is literally dangerous to contradict the prevailing narrative, whatever it may be. It is dangerous to do this. What happened to me at NYU is really nothing compared to what has been happening to certain other people. Doctors like Vladimir Zelenko and Paul Alexander, dissident doctors, excellent doctors, have had to hire their own personal security. Zelenko now carries a gun because he's gotten so many death threats. Dr. Mel Bruchet, a physician in Vancouver, was sounding the alarm in Canada about a sudden inexplicable or seemingly inexplicable uptick in spontaneous miscarriages in Vancouver since the vaccine rollout began there. One night, a bunch of, I think they were Royal Canadian Mounted Police, showed up at his house, abducted him, and had him committed against his will to a psychiatric ward. It took some time for his friends to get him out. They contrived a diagnosis of premature dementia to justify what is essentially a Soviet way of dealing with dissidents, okay? I have several friends who are doctors who have lost their licenses just for treating their patients by trying to prescribe ivermectin. And then, you know, leaving aside the professional realm that's been affected by COVID, if we think and try to do this with some detachment, if we think about the hoo-ha over that attempted coup on January 6th, which was the moment when all this preparatory propaganda linking conspiracy theory to ultra-right violent terrorism, January 6th was kind of the culmination of all that, when we were told with straight faces, even by people like Noam Chomsky, whom you think would know what an attempted coup is, we were told that was an attempted coup by a bunch of yahoos, none of whom had a weapon, who basically did a lot of yelling and screaming in Congress. And we're told that that's somehow comparable to what happened on 9/11, 1973 in Chile, you know, when Pinochet basically bombed the presidential palace and displaced the president, the democratically elected president. We're asked to believe that that oafish lark in the Capitol posed a genuine existential threat to America's Republican democracy. This is ridiculous, but it isn't just ridiculous. Like conspiracy theory now, it is actually quite threatening. It's quite dangerous, because right after that attempted coup, the federal government basically mounted a sweep and arrested scores of people, held them in federal prison on no charges, subjected some of them to routine beatings, denied them medical care. And to my personal astonishment, the entire left, and I've always identified as being on the left, was fine with that. In fact, they even applauded it. Now, I'm old enough to remember the day when the ACLU proudly stood up for the right of the Illinois chapter of the American Nazi Party to mount a march in Skokie, Illinois, which is the home of many Holocaust survivors. Nobody at the ACLU had any use for the Nazis and in no way shared their worldview. They understood that it was the principle of the thing that mattered, that if we have free speech, that means we have free speech for everybody. We don't just have free speech for people like ourselves, see? Now the ACLU has basically abandoned that commitment to free speech and is more fixated on standing on the right side of the issue, which means the left side of the issue. So they're not the only formerly liberal not-for-profit that has made that transition. I suppose I could conclude by saying, since I've been speaking for an hour, that one of the most remarkable things about this propaganda drive, it's not just that it's global, which is unprecedented. And let me add, it's not just that it's no longer merely an episodic phenomenon, okay? When we think back on the history of modern propaganda, we tend to think of propaganda episodes that afflicted various nations at certain times and then ended. And when they ended, it was as if people sort of gradually had to snap out of a trance. This is what happened in World War I, for example. This is what has happened after every war propaganda drive. This is what happened after the Cold War. This is what happened after 9/11, you could say, that there was 9/11 propaganda that obtained for a while and kickstarted the war on terror. And then, you know, there started to emerge some reconsiderations of the narrative. So when we think back on moments prior to the COVID moment, again, we think of propaganda that sort of flared up and then died down again. And then there would be sort of a period of quiet before the next one started. Well, now we're living at a time when propaganda is like an endlessly rolling thunder. The propaganda that began in January of 2020 has actually never ended. The propaganda of 2020 went from the virus panic directly into the masking cult, okay? In the middle of the year, there was the George Floyd moment and BLM's role in that. That actually fit perfectly into the whole narrative of COVID, even though they're very different subjects. Then after 2021, wherein the COVID propaganda narrative morphed from masking into vaccination, and there are connections between those two issues that we could discuss. Just as it appeared that the COVID propaganda narrative was falling apart, just as the toll of the vaccinations, so-called, started spiking dramatically, in the twinkling of an eye, there was an entirely new propaganda narrative that was every bit as bellicose and hostile as the previous 2 years' propaganda, but that now included Republicans along with Democrats, and I'm talking about Ukraine. The Ukraine propaganda is a staggering replay of the propaganda in World War I. Just as that propaganda entailed the outright fabrication of a large body of fake atrocity claims against the Germans, who were called the Huns, now the media has given us, I think, dozens by now of atrocity claims about Russia, every one of which so far, I've studied them all, every one of which is fake, every one of which is invented, every one of which is based on images that come from other conflicts, other countries, with new captions placed on them. And the staggering thing about it is when you point this out to the media outlets that have given life and influence to these stories, they don't care. They don't change. They don't retract. Nothing. So you can know all you want to know and all it's possible to know about the truth behind these claims. It doesn't make any difference because the media system will not stop pumping them out. And since they are what most people know, they are all that most people know about that conflict, they completely believe that the entire narrative, and I could easily spend another hour talking about just that. But the point is that this propaganda drive is unique, first of all, in its globalism. It's unique in its incessancy, its relentlessness, as it's going to shift a little bit from subject to subject, but the totality remains the same. And finally, and most bafflingly, it is the left that is on board primarily with all this. First of all, because the professional classes have turned out to be the most culpable, whose failure to honor the ideals of their respective of those professions has done the most harm. I'm talking about the medical establishment, talking about the academy, okay? And I'm talking about journalism, and to some extent law as well. The professional classes have failed in a way that made this catastrophe inevitable and so far seemingly unstoppable. Although I actually do believe, this may come as a surprise to you, I believe optimistically that this will not succeed. I think it's too grandiose and too perverse to succeed. But that the failure of this project does depend on more and more of us having conversations like this one and speaking out in the face of big lies, no matter what the professional or social consequences are. And I guess I'll say, out of an inability to leave well enough alone, that we really need not to we need to get over our divisions, okay? The oldest trick in the imperial playbook is divide et impera, that's divide and conquer, okay? That comes from the Latin because the Romans were extremely skilled at playing subject peoples off against each other. Before that, the Babylonians did it. The British did it in the 19th and early 20th century. The CIA and FBI have been doing it for decades. In order to keep people away from your throats, you need to have them at each other's throats, you see? So the whole discourse on the left that calls dissidents far right, and the tendency on the right to keep attacking the left for everything that's going on, as say Tucker Carlson does. And I think he does a lot of great work. I don't reject him, even though I used to hate him. He has this tick, which is probably due to the audience he addresses, that it's the left, the left, the left, the left, the left, as if the campus left has taken over the Pentagon, you know, as if they're forcing the employees of Verizon to study critical race theory because the campus left took over Verizon. This is absurd. That has never happened, and it never could happen, okay? What we're talking about is a decades-old covert effort to divide the American people and to balkanize the left, to divide the left into, you know, racial and gender tribes so that they would not look at class and so that they would not think about political economy, right? And so that they would eventually come to applaud Big Pharma. They would come eventually to demand war with Russia. I mean, what kind of left is that? Okay, I'm sorry. I'm 72. I'm giving you my exact age. I was on the left in college. We marched against the war. We were down for civil rights, right? We were certainly opposed to censorship. What is the left now? I don't get it. All I do know is that the collapse of the left throughout the academy, throughout journalism, and you know, elsewhere, has been key to this whole thing in a way that we have to understand if we're going to get beyond this. But what we do have to do is treat each other with some compassion. You know, people who have been vaccinated deserve every kind of compassion and concern. We have to do our best to keep telling them truths that they don't want to hear. We have to talk to young people above all, because I have to say, I have found over the years, young people are more receptive and open-minded than their elders. This is why I love to teach. And I'm afraid this is why I was now prevented from teaching propaganda courses anymore at NYU, because let's face it, I can tell you this in all bluntness, they don't want the slaves to learn how to read, okay? So they don't want students studying propaganda. They want students serving as vectors of propaganda. And that's very easy in a world of social media, but it is something that has to stop, and the sooner the better. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much. That was a really wonderful and thorough talk. Could not have asked for more. I do want to open this for a bit of questions if you have time.
I do.
Great. And I guess I will go first. Speaking to your discussion of the history of conspiracy theorists as a term and as a tool, I've had conversations about this with people who seem to be seem to believe that the actions of the CIA that we now can reflect on as illegal, covert, et cetera, let's say about that time period you were discussing, right, 60s, 70s, they often respond to me by saying, well, that hasn't happened since the church committee, the lauded church committee that had sort of stopped this from happening. And so whenever I bring up cause for suspicion into CIA or any other sort of government intervention, they say, well, it hasn't happened since then. And
Oh my God.
I don't know what you know about that. I was curious.
I know a great deal about it. I've
Yeah.
studied the church committee in depth, and I can tell you that the church, okay, I'll try to make this as succinct as I can. Basically because of Seymour Hersh, who was writing for the New York Times in the early 70s, Congress was basically forced by public pressure to investigate the intelligence agencies. That's why that happened. Seymour Hersh did a front page piece in the New York Times. You know, the Times has always been kind of an abysmal paper, but it was a lot less abysmal than it is now. And there were exceptions writing for them, and they did good things from time to time. And this is an example of that. So they did a front page expose of all the stuff the CIA primarily was doing to American citizens on American soil. You know, this is contrary to their charter. And it really, you know, back then the Times led the pack. The rest of the media, you know, echoed what he had found. And this led to a great deal of public outrage and concern, so that Congress was pressured into having investigations. There were two. The one we've all heard of is the Church Committee. That was the Senate investigation. That was indeed in the mid-70s, as was the one in the House. That was the Pike Committee. Now, we've all heard of the Church Committee. They televised the hearings. You know, they're part of you know, Washington legend. We all know what that is, right? Now we don't know what the Pike Committee hearing was or did, and there's a very important reason for that difference. The Church Committee did not ask for anything from the CIA or the FBI that the CIA and FBI were unwilling to give them. They made no demands. So even though they did, I mean, they're to be credited for making possible certain revelations about dirty doings by those agencies. We found out about the extent of CIA involvement in Chile's coup, for example. We found out about the FBI's harassment of Martin Luther King. I mean, this was a limited hangout because we did not hear anything about the FBI's murder of Fred Hampton, you know, and we didn't hear a lot about all kinds of other stuff, but we did hear about some things. So we should be grateful for that. But the point is, the Church Committee really posed no threat to the CIA, okay? Because here's some interesting background history. George H.W. Bush, having just been appointed head of the CIA, had been appointed head of the CIA to get the CIA through this PR crisis. You know, now for the first time in its history, the CIA had come under public suspicion. In the 60s, nobody thought anything ill of the CIA because they watched Mission Impossible, you know, which was partly written by CIA people. They were on the set. They worked on that show, just as FBI people worked on the show The FBI. Okay, that's propaganda, and it was very successful. Now it was different. This was a crisis because not only had the New York Times come out exposing some of the CIA's crimes, but several veterans of the CIA, several former CIA officers were publishing memoirs that were really eye-opening, especially Inside the Company by Philip Agee. And there were 3 or 4 others that in the mid-70s and up into 1982 or 3 were publishing really good memoirs that are out of print, except for the few that I have republished in the Forbidden Bookshelf series, you know, which you guys can look into if you're interested in these are ebooks that are, you know, ebook editions of important works that have slipped out of print, and many of which were killed at birth. Okay, so you have to get used copies of these books. All right, so George H.W. Bush was brought out of, well, I guess had he been in China yet? I can't keep his career straight. He had a few one-year appointments, and one of them was to head the CIA. His purpose in heading the CIA was to get them through the crisis. And in that capacity, he met with Church Committee senators. He met with Church, he met with the others, and he basically laid down 2 ground rules. This is extremely interesting. He said, there are basically 2 things we want you to avoid or not look into too deeply. One is the CIA's involvement in the media. Okay, and indeed, the Church Committee report only has about 10 pages on that. And the other subject is one on which there are no pages in the Church Committee hearing, and this should interest all of you particularly, and is the CIA's involvement in academia. Okay, Church Committee never looked into that at all. So your university, my university, we have colleagues who are probably CIA officers, okay? Now, that's the Church Committee. So they did not put the kibosh on anything that the CIA was doing, right? Congressional oversight has continued to be as lax as it was before the Church Committee hearing. And what about the Pike Committee hearing? Well, it's very interesting. Unlike the Church Committee, the Pike Committee was loaded for bear. I mean, they really, really wanted to get to the bottom of this stuff, right? So what did? They demanded all kinds of stuff from the CIA. They demanded all kinds of documents, and the CIA absolutely refused. If you want to know how the CIA treated the Pike Committee, just read the 9/11 Commission report, see how Bush Cheney's government treated that committee. It was exactly the same. They stonewalled them, they intimidated them, so that when they finally finished their report, which was much shorter than the Church Committee report, it did contain some pretty valuable information, and I recommend you read it. However, I want to warn you that you're going to have trouble finding it, because as soon as it was completed, the full House voted to classify it. See? So it's not available, except as a used paperback from Britain. So if you go to Amazon UK, you can order a paperback copy of the Pike Report with an introduction by Phil Agee, right? Is it, wait, Philip Agee, is it? Yeah. So, you know, it's a small world. It's worth reading, but the point is, that's, okay, so it's ridiculous to say the Church Committee changed anything. And I mean, these people, look, here's another point I want to make to you all. This is very important. The ongoing success of propaganda drives depends on a certain cumulative ignorance, okay? If you don't know what happened in Dallas in 1963, if you have not looked into that, if you have not looked into 9/11, if you have not looked into those other assassinations and the cover-ups after them, and if you have not looked into the CIA's history beyond the Church Committee hearing, okay, I'm talking about their history up to the present. If you don't know any of that, then you are likely to be all that much more outraged and offended when somebody says, oh, this looks like a false flag operation. You say that to somebody, and they become livid. You know, they become angry. They say, you're far right, you're a conspiracy theorist, you know. But if you know that history, if you study that history, as it took me years to do myself, right? And once I was called a conspiracy theorist, and my career changed completely. I began to devote myself to this kind of study, and now I understand that the things that people dismiss as outrageous claims were actually business as usual forever, see? But because we've been fed a completely antiseptic version of American history in the schools and by the media, we have a kind of sentimental view of those authorities. And we think that a show like Homeland is accurate, or a movie like Argo, it tells us what the CIA is really all about. You know, it's not. You could tell your friends about Ukraine in 2014. Are they unaware of the coup that went down there? They probably are. You know, the ejection of the president of Honduras, who was democratically elected, they threw him out of the country. The sudden death of the president of Haiti after he had signaled his unwillingness to subject the Haitian people to the vaccine regimen. Now, I don't have a memo from the CIA saying that they killed him, but that's the kind of thing they do. And it happened in Tanzania as well with Dr. John Magufuli, a trained chemist who subjected a goat and a pawpaw to the PCR test and found that the fruit and the goat had both tested positive for COVID-19. And on that basis said he was not going to allow the Tanzanian people to be vaccinated. Well, he disappeared at one point. He was missing for 2 weeks, and then he turned up dead. He died of a heart attack. The free press in this country and throughout the West gloatingly reported that he had died of COVID. See? So a whole lot of people on the left are cheering and gloating that this COVID denialist had died of COVID. I mean, this is all the CIA. This is what the CIA does. It has never stopped doing it, okay? So, Blaise, I cannot expect you to educate these people when they say something like that to you. All you can do is suggest to them that no, the CIA did not go out of business in the mid-70s. They have only continued to do what they have always done. And you might, you know, it might just be fun, instead of hammering them with links and evidence and say, read this, read that, etc. just ask them to watch Kill the Messenger, the movie, Kill the Messenger, with Jeremy Renner as, what's his name? Gary Webb, the reporter who broke the story of the CIA's drug dealing in the United States. That's a really good movie, directed by Michael Cuesta, who directed the whole first year of Homeland. But this is a very good movie. It's very honest. I would also suggest to them that they watch The Ghostwriter, the Roman Polanski film from 2010, which is all about Tony and Sherry Blair and their operating at the end of CIA puppet strings, And if you want to shift from the CIA to the FBI, have them watch, of course, this is not since the Church Committee, but still, it's a good movie. Have them watch Judas and the Black Messiah about the murder of Fred Hampton. It's a completely accurate movie. I mean, astonishing that it got made. And I don't think a white director could have got it made, but, God bless the guy who did. Yeah, the fact is, it has continued. It has continued. There's a cable series called Snowfall, which is all about the CIA's drug dealing in South Central Los Angeles. That's since the Church Committee. Okay, so you have my sympathy, Blaise. I know how frustrating it is. Believe me, I know how frustrating it is. But yeah.
Thank you. I welcome anybody else to ask a question.
Hi, thanks so much for the invigorating talk.
I'm glad you describe it that way.
Yeah.
People often say, "Oh, you've depressed me."
I was curious, a lot of how I see the evolution of propaganda. I mean, you brought up the way that conspiracy theory shifts from being something that's mostly kind of treated with a kind of contempt and ridicule, to being something that's kind of elevated as a great nemesis. So one other thing that kind of has gone along with that is the rise of this whole discourse about disinformation and misinformation.
Yeah.
And, part of what's interesting about that is it kind of takes something from the history of propaganda and then uses that as propaganda. So it's sort of like, I remember reading all these things from, I don't know, around 2016, 2017, that were like the history of that term, right? And it would talk about like how, the Soviets planted this article that was about, how the US government invented the AIDS virus or something like that. And they planted it in some small newspaper in India, and then it gradually spread, right?
Right.
So this was like the sort of origin story of like what disinformation is that was spread, which, I guess is interesting, because this whole disinformation framing is itself this incredibly potent and sinister propaganda, because basically what it does, as far as I see it, is actually direct, or what it's been mainly used to do is direct people's concerns away from governments, except for Putin, of course, the great master of disinformation. But other than Putin, basically the thing we're supposed to be worried about is like random people posting memes. And the great dangers to our society, it's, sort of 20-year-old unemployed guys in basements posting on 4chan or whatever. And meanwhile, that's where all the false ideas are coming from. And meanwhile, this has the convenient effect of directing our concerns entirely away from people with actual power. So it's been a really, so I'm just curious kind of how you see the emergence of that disinformation framing, and what you see it as having done, because it seems odd, in part because it actually thematizes propaganda and tries to attune people to it, but then it does it in such a way as to make them necessarily kind of miss the big story. And then of course there was this bizarre episode recently with the attempt to create the Department of Homeland Security Disinformation Board, which then they which itself was such a bizarre episode that it almost seemed like a psyop. But anyway.
Yeah, I hear you.
Yeah.
Well, let me make a historical note to begin with. The Allied propagandists in World War I were, by their own admission, extremely careful never to use the word propaganda except in relation to the Germans. So everything the Germans said was propaganda, and everything we said was truth, right? So actually and it was World War I that actually acquainted the British and American people with that word propaganda, which was not well known or widely used. In the 1911 Encyclopedia Britannica, there's not even an entry for propaganda. There's an entry for propagate, but not for propaganda. World War I made everybody aware of propaganda, but because of its selective use as a synonym for German lying, people thought of it as an enemy practice. And all those syllabi I mentioned to you before that continue to treat propaganda as something the other does, it really dates from the beginning, right? So what you're saying is quite true, that disinformation, I remember during the Cold War or before the fall of the Soviet Union, that people on the right were talking about disinformation as a Soviet thing, right? That actually has kind of a long history, right? What's really kind of daunting at the moment is the brazenness with which the government, and not just this government, with which governments now call truth disinformation and represent disinformation as fact. It is disorienting. It has elements of a psyop because it's so, on people like us, it has a really dizzying effect, to see the US set up a disinformation governance board and to be joined in running it by the UK and the EU. So all these countries that formerly represented the democratic West are now doing exactly what the Inner Party does in 1984. The Disinformation Governance Board is the Ministry of Truth. What else could it be? It is really kind of staggering and chilling. And let me return to the question of the left. It now seems to me to be not an exaggeration to say the following. The left now identifies as being those people who never doubt a government narrative. That's who the left is now. They don't doubt a government narrative. If you doubt a government narrative, you are you're a redneck, you're a Nazi, right? Now, let me say something about this. You mentioned these unemployed guys in their basements. You're absolutely right that this has a way of distracting us from the power. I don't know if you guys have read Bobby Kennedy's book about Fauci. It is indispensable. It is a masterpiece. And it's a really supreme example of good propaganda because it does such a serious and effective job at telling people history they've been deprived of for the last 40 years. There you go. Good. It is a great book. Now, I can't even remember why I mentioned that book, but the point I want to make is that the left now identifies as being those who buy every government narrative, and the corollary of that is those who don't buy government narratives are enemies of the people. We're unsafe because of them. We're not safe because of them, because they want to kill us. They're murderous. They're all white supremacists. They're all violent homo and transphobes, etc. And they're all, they want to overthrow the government. They want to steal the election. I mean, let me say parenthetically, effective propaganda, effective war propaganda is always projective. Okay, it's always projective. It's what some of the Nuremberg prosecutors called accusation in the mirror. Where you accuse your enemy of doing what you're actually doing, or of planning what you're actually planning, or of having done what you already did. So it's very, very dizzying. But I think that there's a more straightforward way to put what we're describing here. It isn't just that we're being distracted from attention to the real danger, which is the elites, which is the medical industrial complex, right? Which is still the military industrial complex, as Bobby demonstrates in his last chapter. They're still in charge. Big pharma's in charge. These are the most, lethal corporate interests I could ever have imagined. We should be at their throats instead of at each other's throats. But I would go beyond saying that they're trying to distract us from critical attention to the state and to the elites behind the state. But they're also basically turning their big guns on the people, okay? The people. And we don't see this to the extent that we buy into the whole divisive left-right melodrama. See, to the extent that we see ourselves primarily as the adversaries of the right and see the working class as far right, we are basically serving the elites, you see. I was completely blown away by the response of the left. And these are people who were my friends. You have to understand this, okay? Because when I say the left, I don't do it the way Tucker Carlson does it. He's never on the left, but I was. And I was friends with Amy Goodman and Noam Chomsky and Michael Moore and all of them. The way they were all talking about the truckers in Canada completely freaked me out, because this was a working class resistance. That's what that was, okay? That's what the truckers are. And people like my colleagues, depend on these guys to get their packages from Amazon, okay? That's the working class, right? These people were calling them fascists. They were calling them Nazis. Michael Moore wrote this foaming at the mouth piece saying, "Get off my fucking bridge." I mean, it was unbelievable, right? But that's what we're actually dealing with here. The state has turned its guns increasingly from third world countries that have left the reservation and increasingly against the American people, right? So that the FBI has now explicitly defined parents who complain at school board meetings as domestic terrorists. I mean, seriously, right? Domestic terrorists because they have a beef with the school board. We're actually living, we're at war now, okay? We are now at war. And to the extent that we're all, members of the community of the academy, we may be somewhat distracted from that fact that we are at war, we are under attack by elite interests, because, many people on the left have had their vision kind of skewed by their self-identification as enemies of the right, by which they really mean enemies of the people. I think the left-right thing has got to go. Where did it come from? It came from the French General Assembly and the Revolution, the left side of the room and the right side of the room. That's where it comes from. I mean, do we still need that? Is that really relevant today? We're living, at a moment of unprecedented crisis that is global, and that is waged, a war that's waged on us by interests that really mean business in a way that previous elites have not. Jeff, did I answer you?
Yeah, that was great and comprehensive. I mean, I think, I was curious to get more of your thoughts on because I really did, the fact that they put this woman who was the face of the disinformation board was such a kind of ridiculous character and had all these absurd videos and so on. So it was almost like, and so then the kind of disbanding of it just seemed like.
Well, wait, have they actually disbanded it? I don't think so.
Or it's like not disbanded, but I guess they've sort of suspended it in some way. But it just seemed like such an obvious sort of.
Well, Jeff, this is what I think happened, and it's a speculation, but I'm fairly confident that it's true. I don't think that they could possibly have been unaware of what a ludicrous choice that woman was. But that song. That Mary Poppins. And then immediately the discussion was excessively devoted to her being the head of it.
Exactly.
Well, who cares who's the head of it? So I think that they put her there so that people would say, "Oh, are you serious?" And then they could say, "Oh, well, never mind," because now the name we're hearing is the name of Michael Chertoff. Do you know who that is?
Bush era DHS, right?
That's right. He headed the DHS under Bush. His company is the one that makes those carcinogenic X-ray machines in the airports. There's nothing corrupt about that. He's now, so Biden, the Democratic administration has dragged this monster out of retirement from the Bush-Cheney days to run their Ministry of Truth. And I think that's probably by design, that they picked this patent flake to do it, and everybody predictably goes bananas, because of her, instead of the principle of having a Ministry of Truth at all. And then they pick this awful guy that nobody's going to, condemn because he's not some flaky woman. He's just a very, self-possessed, predatory monster, and that's okay because he's not her.
Stephen, you can go.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Mark. Stephen Napier, I'm at philosophy department at Villanova University. This past semester, I taught a class on COVID-19 ethics. Basically 2 questions. One is, I would like to have your syllabus for your propaganda course, see what you read, because I actually had a section on propaganda or media ethics in my class. The second thing, I want to ask in the context of your thoughts on, or your comments about ivermectin. In a way, it struck me that there's just, in terms of propaganda, it can only be so false before everyone sees it to be false. And so what amazed me though is that even the medical professionals, you have IBMmeta.com, which has the meta level database on all the ivermectin studies. But even the medical professionals, and my field is COVID clinical ethics, even the medical professionals I was talking to had this knee-jerk reaction against ivermectin. People who know how to read studies and research and understand, randomized controlled trials and the statistical methods, et cetera. So I'm wondering, what are your thoughts on how false does propaganda, or how false can propaganda get before everyone sees it?
That's a really good question. But before I answer it, let me say, if you email me, I'll send you some syllabi.
Okay, great.
It's Mark Crispin Miller at PM, that's Proton Mail, pm.me. Any of you who wants syllabi, I'll send. The syllabi for my course are sort of works in progress, because I tell the class at the beginning, we don't actually know what's going to break this semester. So, we might depart from the script, from the template. And let me ask, before I talk about how false propaganda can be, do you know Julie Ponesse? Do you know her story?
I don't. No.
Well, she was an ethics professor at Ontario Western University. And she, on ethical grounds, refused to get injected. There's a mandate at the university, and she refused to do it for ethical reasons. She made a very moving video where she explained why she had no choice but to say no to this. And then they fired her. So I can give you her email address. You might want to connect with her. She's extremely nice. And she wrote a book that came out about 6 months ago about her ordeal. Okay, how false can it be? The thing is that, I share your wonderment that medical professionals can be so blind to what the science actually says. And what this tells us is that they actually don't read it. They don't read the science, okay? Most doctors, I've heard this said by some people who have MD degrees, that in medical school, they devote all of like half a day to vaccinology. They don't study it. See, they don't teach them about it. And it's not hard to understand why. There's a great deal of money at stake in preserving the whole vaccine cult. There is no money available for testing vaccines for safety, not a penny available. Just as there's no money available for studying the impact of Fukushima on the health of people and animals in the West Coast and in Canada. There's no money to see how much carcinogenic radioactivity has affected crops and livestock there. There's no money for that. So these agendas are all determined by funding. Doctors only know what's, what is in their own purview, and they know nothing else. And I've been astonished by the ignorance of doctors. I have Lyme disease. I've had it for like over a decade. And I just spent months as the patient of a very famous Lyme specialist. It cost a lot of money. And this guy not only insisted that everybody coming to the office wear a mask, so he never read those studies, but he got vaccinated and was exulting. We had a telemedicine visit, and he was so happy that he was now immune. Now, how can he not know that those shots do not confer immunity? How can he not know that? I mean, even Pfizer said that quietly, but they never pretended to confer immunity. They just said, if you get it, it won't be a severe case. That's not immunity. This guy's, you know what I'm saying? So, we think, I suppose, because we're academics, we think that doctors must study all the literature pertinent to what they do, right? But they don't. They don't study it. They don't know. And they're like everybody else in the professional classes. They don't want to be exiled, right? They don't want to commit professional suicide, which they would be doing if they sounded like McCullough, Malone, Zelenko, Mikovits, the list goes on and on. Now, how false can a narrative be? Well, I'm going to have to answer in all honesty. It can be pretty damn false for an awful long time, okay? It can be false until it becomes literally impossible to keep the truth at bay. There's an example of the lethal consequences of big lies maintained too long. It's in William Shirer's Berlin Diary. He was the CBS reporter who was, stationed in Berlin in the 30s until they finally threw him out. And he would do radio broadcasts, and try to get around the censors with code and innuendo and stuff like that. But he kept this great diary that became a bestseller when he returned. He had to smuggle it out of Germany in his clothes. And there's one entry, Shirer had been out of the country, he'd been elsewhere in Europe for a few weeks, and then he came back. And when he came back just as the German press, this is under Goebbels, on the front of every newspaper in the country, there were all these scare stories about Poland's intention to attack Germany. Okay? Poland was planning to attack Germany. And Shirer had been outside the country. So everybody elsewhere knew what was happening, that Germany was preparing to attack Poland, as they then did on September 1st, 1939. And that started the war. So it's a very powerful entry in the diary. Shirer says, you ask yourself, he quotes a bunch of these headlines, and they're all psychotic. He asks, how is it that the German people can believe this? And he said, you ask them, and so many do. He was just stunned, right? But it kind of makes sense, because if these other Germans had not been outside the country, if everything they read, everything they saw on the newsreels, everything they heard, everything on the radio, if it was all saying the same thing, why shouldn't the falsehood stand, right? This is Plato's cave, basically. Well, if to the extent that we fixate on our favorite media, and to the extent that we customize our media diet through social media, which is to say we allow ourselves to see only the things we want to see, well, why shouldn't we doubt that the Ukrainian military forces are Nazis, right? Why shouldn't we say that's Russian propaganda? Why should we doubt that the vaccines are safe and effective? It's all we hear is that they are. People like us are professionally obligated and liberated to study the propaganda in ways that most people don't have the time to do, or the inclination. We do, right? If you all go on to teach or write about propaganda, you will have the luxury, oh, it's kind of a painful luxury, but you'll have the luxury of being able to look beyond the proscenium of the media, whether it's the left press or the corporate media. Neither one is, they're the same, and they're no different. Right? We can look beyond the proscenium and we can kind of see what's going on. But most people are too busy. They don't have, right? They're not taught to do it in school, and they don't want to do it. They don't have time to do it. And again, I want to stress again, they don't want to believe those things anyway. See? But having said all this, Stephen, I will say that there is a kind of natural limit to how false things can be. And that limit comes when the direct experience of enough people is antithetical to the narrative. See, when that happens, the propaganda is doomed. And that's a point that Jacques Ellul makes in his book on propaganda from 1965. When there's a sufficiently vivid contradiction between the narrative, what you're hearing and what you're seeing, the propaganda is doomed, except for the fact that there are always people so deeply hypnotized that they can't snap out of it, no matter how dramatic the contradiction. But as time goes on, their numbers dwindle. And the example I use from pre-COVID days is the war in Vietnam. Why did it end? Well, it did not end because of people like me marching and belly aching. I mean, that only actually pissed a lot of people off, I realize now. The war in Vietnam ended because the casualty rate was so high. See, we had a draft, right? We had a draft. When we had a draft, that meant that, a whole lot of average people had kids over there. Not privileged people, but average people, right? And when enough of them had died, or when enough people had lost someone or knew people who lost someone in that meat grinder, then they had to end it. They had no choice. They could not bullshit people out of knowing what they know. Now, this is a little bit more challenging because people are so deeply hypnotized. And I don't know if you guys have been following Matthias Desmet, the Belgian clinical psychologist who has talked about mass formation. It's very good stuff. And his new book, The Psychology of Totalitarianism, is really well worth reading. He comes up with a very persuasive model. It's based on Hannah Arendt of what it is that makes people hypnotized by what he calls mass formation, right? There are people so deeply hypnotized that even when they lose someone to a vaccine, they absolutely can't see it. They become livid when you suggest it, right? And there are even people, and this is scary, who will lose somebody to a vaccine and then say, well, it could have been worse if we hadn't had the shot. What do you even say to that? I mean, it's not even, it's just sad, it's awful. But that's what we're dealing with. Propaganda is not just certain claims, true or false. It's not just that. It's something much deeper than that. It's something that works on us almost like neurologically. And it's kind of like we base our identity on it, So it's powerful, and that's why we really need to grasp it more critically.
Thank you so much.
I have a follow-up question related, and also Stephen, if you want, if you look up Aaron Kheriaty at UC Irvine, where I'm at, he was the director of medical ethics, and he was fired for not getting vaccinated.
Wow. What's his name?
Aaron Kheriaty.
I'm sorry, what?
Aaron Kheriaty.
Aaron,
Oh,
okay.
I do know Aaron. Yeah.
Yeah. He was fired because he refused to get vaccinated because he had concerns about the vaccines and ethical concerns with the mandate at UCI.
Okay.
I just wanted to follow up a little bit about your mass psychosis and the vaccination thing. So part of like why Blaze and I organized this conference was we both were like, okay, well, why is no one being critical of any of this in the academy? The academy prides itself on having a critical impetus, and both Blaze and I are in the humanities or whatever, and we allegedly have a critical impetus. All our grad student friends all say that they have a critical theory impetus. And I'm wondering if you, because you brought up mass psychosis, and as soon as that came out with like Robert Malone mentioning it, all my friends who do stuff on like the Frankfurt School and all this were like, well, that's not true. Adorno disproved this, blah, 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 Deleuze this, Deleuze that. And I'm curious if you have any thoughts about like, if our academic like theoretical idols and our theoretical reference points, so to speak, or kind of true north compasses, so to speak, if that actually limits the imagination for truly critical impetus towards universities, towards governance, and lends itself to accepting propaganda, or so like I think of like the fact that Deleuze is easily adopted by like the IDF and stuff. And so I'm just curious if you think who we choose as our theoretical gods and leaders impedes the possibility of any kind of clear thinking on some of these issues.
Great question. Well, I think we probably could agree, and maybe even your colleagues might agree with the abstract advisement to give up gods and leaders, right? We don't need gods and leaders. I mean, we need to think for ourselves. But I certainly take your point, and I think it's absolutely correct. Academics, especially in the humanities and social sciences, have long since fetishized theory. Okay, that defines the academy. You know, I mean, when I got into media studies, I never took a single course in communications. I got my doctorate in English in the 70s. You know, I was in the literature of the Renaissance. I wrote about Shakespeare. I never took a communications course, and I'm glad I never did. It's so boring and irrelevant. And as I drifted into media studies, you know, via film studies, I was always quite upfront about being interested in it, because I think there's an emergency, you know, going on. The democracy in America is at grave risk for various reasons, many of them having to do with the media. And so I wanted to teach, you know, critical understanding of the media. I never wanted to teach media theory. I never wanted to teach film theory. When I did film, and when I do film, it's practical criticism. It's, you know, finding all these great depths and complexities in movies that you might have dismissed as simpler than they really are. Movies that the more you watch them, the more interesting and beautiful they become. It's an aesthetic thing, really. I'm not interested in film theory, and I'm not interested in media theory. I'm interested in the practical criticism of media and in understanding its structure, right? But what this does, what the embrace of theory with a capital T has done, has freed academics from the obligation to think genuinely critically about power relations in the world they live in. They don't do that ever. Instead, they, you know, self-importantly jabber away about theory this and theory that. And they'll talk about Deleuze and Adorno. You know, I was heavily influenced by Adorno, the dialectic of enlightenment. But the fact is that I don't know if you've read any of James Lindsay's stuff. He is very good on Marcuse in particular. You know, Marcuse really did exert a very powerful influence on the development of woke culture and you know, the evolution or devolution of the left into what it is today. Parenthetically, I think that Lindsay should pay more attention to the role of the intelligence agencies, which have also had a great deal to do with disabling the left. But at any rate, theory is a way for young, well, not just young, but it's a way for fairly well-paid members of the professional class in the academy to tell themselves that they are critical when they're not. There's nothing critical about them. They are fully compliant with all the COVID rules, you know, every single one of them. They are absolute purists. They're conformists. They have contempt for the people. white people. They fetishize Black people in a way that's patronizing and completely racist, and they give all this a gloss of theory, but no, I'm sorry. I take no pleasure in saying this, but someday when this is over and the perpetrators have been brought to justice, or some of them, these people are going to have to look themselves in the eye, and face up to where they were while this was all going on, right? Those who have survived their vaccinations, I mean. But yeah, that was a good question. The theory fetish has ensured the irrelevance of academics in the humanities and the social sciences, it seems to me.
Awesome, thank you. Anyone else have any questions? I know it's a little later over in the East Coast than we're in California.
I do. I have a quick, really practical question, and thank you for that talk. It was fantastic. So my question is, I was interested in your description of this idea of kind of being essentially at war with a kind of regime or elite class that we're participating in to some degree. I think probably everyone here has had the experience of, not being in conflict with some external person or people in an institution or whatever, but essentially friends, loved ones, family members, people that you're close to, who are essentially completely to partially hypnotized by one or more of these propaganda narratives. And I don't know if there is a real answer to this, but I was just wondering if you had any practical considerations for people in that position to start opening up a conversation, or just any way to sort of make a difference to help show people out of this kind of trance.
Yeah, good question. I thought about this a great deal. Having lost a lot of friends over the last 2 years, I'm lucky in that my own family is rational, But my practical answer to this is, I can tell you what not to do. One thing you should not do is assail people, pelt them with counter evidence, send them all kinds of links and stuff. It's not going to work because it's telling them something that's going to scare them, for one thing, but it's also not going to work because that just doesn't work. I mean, the way I teach my propaganda classes is the way that you might consider approaching these people, which is assuming you're on, civil terms with them. You kind of bring them along and you urge them to look into certain things for themselves. I wouldn't send them a million links, but you might mention somebody's name, and you couch the suggestion in very flexible terms. The debate is still going on about this, but there's evidence of X and there's evidence of Y, etc. But when it comes to people who are really hypnotized and just glare at you, and insult you, you just don't bother. Okay, forget it. It's a waste of energy. It's not good for your immune system to subject yourself to that kind of abuse. When people are somewhat open, then you take advantage of that opening and approach them in that kind of tentative way I've recommended over time, and hope that they snap out of it. Now, if you know people who've had one shot and had a bad reaction to it, often they will be disinclined to get the second. Often people who've had a bad time with either of the first two will not get boosted, Of course, there are people who will have a bad time and therefore get boosted, but those are not people you can talk to, It's heartbreaking. It can be really heartbreaking because you find yourself at odds with, people you're close to over something that should not separate people, So, I mean, that's the best I can do for advice. It's something I continue to think about all the time. But I do get the feeling this could be an illusion. This could be wishful thinking, but I get the feeling that the numbers of those who are skeptical is growing and growing, you know, as must happen over time. Now, the genius of the Ukraine thing was that it gave people seemingly completely different thing to obsess about. So that the exact same people who were wearing 3 masks are now dyeing their hair blue and yellow, you know what I'm saying? And thinking about it just as little, you know, and knowing just as little about what's actually going on. I'm just going to start stammering in astonishment at this, but how do you tell people that the Ukrainian military are Nazis? You know, how many videos can you send them? How many horrible videos showing atrocities? I mean, I don't know. But at a certain point, we have to just be humble enough to face the fact that our powers are limited. And when people are hypnotized, they're hypnotized, you know. There's a great book that was published in 1841. Some of you may know it. It's called Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds. You know that book, Blaze? Yeah. Henry McKay, I think his name is. And this was his history of humanity as a mass that was subject to periodic fits of insanity, you know. So he's got a chapter on the witch burnings. He's got a chapter on the tulip craze in Holland, you know, the South Sea bubble, alchemy, right? It's a terrific book. It's poignant to read it now because he's writing about crazes that for the most part were not really orchestrated or provoked on purpose. They just kind of happened, right? I mean, arguably the church may have had something to do with witch burnings in some way, but these were not the result of deliberate orchestration of mass lunacy. Now they have found the formula for inducing those kinds of things in people. That's what's happened. The vaccine insanity has been induced. I mean, let's just talk about that for 1 minute. Since when are people not completely serene after they've been vaccinated against something, right? Since when? Like all my life, when one was vaccinated, one stopped worrying about the illness, right? That seems like too self-evident even to have to say. And now you've got all these people who are even more paranoid once they're vaccinated because they think the unvaccinated are going to make them sick. Well, so they don't believe in their vaccinations. This is so elementary, but you can't even make that point to people. Not even to doctors, Stephen. Not even to doctors. I mean, this is really amazing. But you know, we are kind of dealing with, it's like black magic, you know, it really is. It feels like black magic. This is the kind of thing I never used to say. I used to never talk about evil and stuff like that, right? But I do now because I think that that's what this is. You know? It's really, it's something that you can't really deal with in your usual academic head, you see, because this is something much, much weirder and more perverse and bizarre than anything we've gone through in the past. I hope that's helpful.
It's very helpful. Thank you.
Also, let me add, Connor, that if you can get hold of guidance for people who've been vaccinated to help them get well, because there are some promising remedies. If you give that to people, then that demonstrates that you think you mean well for them. You know, you're not just hectoring them and calling them sheep or whatever you think they are. You know, there is stuff out there. I share it with my list, and you know, I feel morally obliged to, you know, tell people about it.
That's great. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay. All right. So this was fun.
This was awesome.
Are you willing to let this be publicized, or would you rather keep it to yourselves?
That's the plan.
Like it. Yeah, we wanted to make sure that was okay with you.
Yeah. I'll share. If you send me the link, I'll share it.
Yeah, so
You know, I just spoke to, what's his name's people the other day, Thursday, Reiner Fulmich, you know, the Coronavirus Investigative Committee.
mhm.
Yeah, that was good. In fact, it was Matthias Desmet and me, first him, then me. And I just put it up on my Substack if you want to see it. And I'll say some things there that you heard me say today.
No, the plan was, so one of the presenters, he couldn't make it to the talk because of prior obligations. Said he'll help me. I'm recording it, and then I'm going to try to like splice the panels up from the previous 2 days and put them on Odyssey or something, or YouTube, and then we'll
Great.
splice everything up.
Great. And I will definitely share this with my pals at the Organization for Propaganda Study. They'll be thrilled by this.
Yeah, no, this was
And
awesome.
you should all hook up with that whole bunch because it's an international network of academics and journalists, very good people who've really taken their lumps, from, for questioning the Syria narrative, for criticizing Israel, you name it. They're vilified in the media. Some of them have been fired, So the more of us wake up in the academy, the better it will be for everybody.
Yeah, no,
Although to be perfectly honest, I have stopped believing that these institutions can be reclaimed. The academy, journalism, medicine, we need to build these institutions over again. We do. We need to start our own college, Stephen, Julie Panesi is now part of one of these new online colleges, and I'm the Freedom Travel Alliance, which is a great outfit, has hosted 2 courses that I have co-taught over the last several months with Rob Williams, who teaches in Vermont. And this was a student body of people all over the world. And we are looking into actually purchasing a campus in Vermont, a campus that's for sale, because we would like to, teach again in a human institution and not necessarily one that's in cyberspace,
No, I was texting Blaze in the discussion, and for me, this was just, the whole conference was kind of encouraging because I'm a grad student at UCI, and it was just encouraging. Like I was telling people I'm a little bit lucky that the committee member is the editor of Telos Journal, so like one of the few academic journals that publishes some kind of weird, interesting, not so like some heterodox stuff every now and again, but like nothing interesting gets done in the academy. There's that critical impetus, and so this was just kind of encouraging and was good to see that there's some cool like thinkers out in the wide world out there doing stuff that I think is cool.
Thank you both so much for inviting me. I had a good feeling about it, and yeah, I'm glad I did it. So thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you so much. This was amazing. And I will share, and we will share anything that comes up, and if we have more questions, etc. So
Okay.
I bid you all a wonderful evening.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Thank you.